Okay, it's 12 o'clock and I think let's get started. Thanks everybody for joining us today for this workshop, an online workshop featuring Jenna Phillips. And I'm Michelle Martin. I am the Climate Training Program Specialist at the Waterloo Climate Institute. And hopefully through the process of this registration, or maybe before, a lot of you will have heard about the Climate Institute. We're based at the University of Waterloo, and we're really a hub for climate research and education. And in an effort to really step up our engagement with students, we have started up a student climate leaders program. And you can check out more about that on our website. And this session today is part of that series. And also you might want to check out, if you go on our website, you'll see some of the events. You can sign up for a climate drinks event for students that the Student Climate Council is hosting this Friday at, I think it's from 6 to 7:30 at the Grad Lounge. So if you want a chance to meet people, network, meet students from other faculties, the Climate Leaders Program is set up to do exactly that. So we're really happy to have this event today and to welcome Jenna Phillips, who is a graduate of University of Waterloo, from the Masters in Global Governance program. She just graduated, I think, just finished up last year. And Jenna is a climate change communicator, and she's done all kinds of interesting things, one of which is founding the Clean the Air program, which is targeting youth and providing means for youth to get involved in climate action. And she's also been really involved in a number of programs, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's part of the reason why we invited Jenna to host a session, to explain a little bit about her experience and background, and really to help people understand a bit more what is the COP anyway, and how can youth and University of Waterloo students get involved in that with that. And so on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Jenna. But just before that, I also do want to mention that I'm so happy and grateful to be able to live and work today. The University of Waterloo is on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral Peoples. And finding ways to integrate climate action with reconciliation is really a great opportunity for us. So I'm happy to be here and be kicking off this series. Over to you, Jenna.
Great. Thanks so much, Michelle. If everyone will just bear with me for a moment while I get my slides set up, and I might just ask somebody to confirm now that they can see everything okay. I can't see anybody, so a verbal cue would be very helpful.
Looks fantastic.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm really excited to chat with you all today over the lunch hour. I really appreciate you taking the time to connect with us. Before we get into the actual conversation, Michelle provided a little bit of a land acknowledgement for Waterloo, where most of you are probably situated. As Michelle mentioned, I've graduated now, and I'm now living in the capital of Canada, Ottawa, which is also the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. And I think it's really important to acknowledge not just the land that we are situated on and who it belongs to, but the role that Indigenous peoples have in climate action and climate leadership, and that we can't be having conversations about climate change governance at the national scale, international, like at the COP conferences, or even at the local scale without talking about reconciliation and colonization and the role that that's played in the climate change challenges of today, as well as the climate change solutions that we're trying to build. A bit of an agenda for today. I wanted to provide an overview on the COP conference, but more important, or not more importantly, but the people who facilitate the COP conferences, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And you can't really understand COP and how that works without understanding the UNFCCC, which is the acronym that we tend to use for that, because the whole name, as you can tell, is a mouthful. So today we'll go through what is the UNFCCC. We'll talk about the timeline of how that was established, as well as how they started to host these climate change conferences. We'll also talk about the structure of the UNFCCC and the outcomes that they try to achieve, because those directly feed into what we talk about in the COP conferences. We'll really dive into the conferences and what their purpose is. We'll talk about the one that's coming up actually this Thursday it's starting on November 30th, which is COP28. And then we'll also talk a bit about what Canada is doing and Canada's role in the COP conferences and within the Framework Convention. We'll talk about youth, like yourselves, and what you can do, whether you're attending a COP, you're watching, or you're just interested in climate action. And then we'll finish up with some resources where you can learn more about COPs or climate action, where you can actually go and take action further. And we'll do a bit of a Q&A. So we should have about 10 minutes or so for a Q&A in the end. And if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat as we go, and then we'll follow up on them towards the end. And there will also be a few facilitated engagement activities throughout this. So I just encourage you to start thinking about climate action, any questions you might have, and get ready to participate a little bit. So first things first, why do we have the COP conferences and who is behind them? The answer would be the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is where it can be a little bit confusing, which is why I wanted to start off with this piece. The UNFCCC is both a treaty that was agreed on at an international level, and it's a facilitator. It's a body that enacts and coordinates this treaty. And they're just considered generally the secretariat. So if we look at the treaty or the convention, it was established because global leaders in the 90s were recognizing the growing threat of climate change and the need for coordinated action. The ultimate goal of this convention is to stabilize greenhouse gases at what they would say is a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic, which means human-induced interference with the climate system. In such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So that's the overall goal of this treaty, and that's the purpose that we have for it. When it was first signed in 1992 at the Rio Summit, there were 166 countries who signed on, but now this has gone up to 198 countries, making it near universal. And it really puts the onus on what we might consider developed countries, or also considered Annex 1 countries under the United Nations systems. And the reason that we do that is because, as many of you will know, it's been these developed countries, including Canada, who have largely contributed to the climate change problem through rapid development, consumerism, and all these other factors, versus developing countries who haven't had much of that contribution historically, and they are now facing the consequences of what developed countries like Canada have done over the past few decades. So this treaty is really trying to focus on those developed countries and making sure that they are taking responsibility for their actions. And then if we look at the Secretariat, you can't have such a big treaty or convention without some sort of group specifically designated to coordinate the action on it. We can't just give this treaty to the United Nations and say, okay, go coordinate it, because it's huge and it deserves its own entity to try and facilitate that. So the United Nations established the Secretariat, which was originally hosted in Geneva in Switzerland, but it then moved to Bonn in Germany. And that's what this photo on the slide is. That's their office, which they call the Climate Tower. So the Secretariat is made up of over 450 staff from over 100 countries. And this is also where interns or fellows who end up working with the United Nations Framework Convention, this is where they end up going to work. And I can talk about it a bit more later, but I ended up doing my internship with the UNFCCC, and this is where I worked in Bonn, and it's a really cool place. But the purpose of the Secretariat is, in addition to facilitating and hosting the COP conferences, they provide technical guidance, reporting, planning, and executing on national climate action plans. And they facilitate any sort of agreements or outcomes that come from the COP conferences and make sure that countries aren't just promising something and then not taking action. They make sure that the countries are actually turning those words into action. Before we go any further, though, I would love to hear how familiar everybody is with the Framework Convention on Climate Change, whether it's the Secretariat or the treaty, just to get a sense of where you're at in your climate journey. And so now we have a poll that should be coming up on your screen. If you can just select one of these options and we can see where everybody stands. So at this point, it looks like we have a little bit of a balance between unfamiliar or new and somewhat knowledgeable. There's still a few answers coming in. And I will just preface with, it's okay if you don't know much about the Framework Convention. Even though I interned with them, I didn't know much up until when I started that internship, and it was a big learning process because you don't really understand what these are. Even if you're really involved in the climate action space, you don't see a lot of conversation about the technicalities of it and why it matters. So all levels of understanding are welcome to this conversation, and hopefully by the end of this conversation, you'll have a lot stronger of an understanding and be able to take that knowledge and implement it in your everyday climate action initiatives. So I'll end the results here. I realize you probably couldn't have seen them until just now, but as you can see, it's a good balance between unfamiliar and somewhat knowledgeable. And hopefully towards the end, you'll all start gearing more into that somewhat knowledgeable or very knowledgeable space. But again, all levels are welcome to this conversation. Great. So now we will move on and talk a bit about the road to the Framework Convention and how it came to be. And I should say that this wasn't just one moment in time where the countries decided we need a global treaty on climate action. There were a lot of smaller initiatives that led up to this moment. It really, in my eyes, started in 1987 when the Montreal Protocol was signed. And this was the first international treaty that focused explicitly on reducing a certain kind of emissions. This one was more focused on reversing ozone destruction that was being caused by CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons. I struggle to say that word all the time, but the chemicals that were involved in refrigerant coolings and things like that were shown to be depleting our ozone, which we now know is really destructive for the planet. And so this agreement was mainly facilitated by the United States, but it really demonstrated that countries can come together despite their differences and take rapid action. And today we've seen almost complete reversal of that ozone depletion, and it's almost fully recovered. So that is an amazing feat for us as humans to be able to do. And at the same time, in 1987, we saw the Brundtland Report come out, which is more commonly known as Our Common Future. And this was a report that established the idea of sustainable development on a global scale, and recognizing that we can't just be building communities for the sake of building. We also need to be considering this concept of sustainability and how our actions today will impact future generations. And so this really paved the way for conversations around what are we doing to our planet and how will human development impact it and how can we manage that? Then in 1988, we saw the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this was a scientific body explicitly set to do science on climate change. I should note that they don't really do any primary scientific data collection, but they compile resources from all other places. They are well-known scientists. There's actually quite a few professors from the University of Waterloo who have been writers for these reports that they put out every few years. And the IPCC was established by the United Nations Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization, who at the time were doing some of this climate change research, but they realized that we needed a lot more to be addressing this problem that was becoming more and more known in the 20th century. Then in 1992, we saw the convention being signed at the Rio Summit, like I mentioned, and this was really the turning point. So we said that we needed a treaty to act on climate change, and we established the Secretariat to take action on that. And then in 1994, the convention was actually enforced. So the treaty was enforced. And that meant that some of the requirements that countries agreed to under this treaty were now required by international law. in terms of what the treaty actually covers, it's quite broad, but they really try to take this holistic understanding of climate change. One of the first things it tries to do is acknowledge the problem on a global scale. I think this was very revolutionary for its time in the 90s when climate change wasn't a household issue. But now it's something that we all recognize and we understand and know we need to take action on. But at the time, it was quite revolutionary. And so that was one of its core objectives. It also set out to create lofty but specific goals, recognizing that countries have different starting points, different contributions to climate change, and different capacities to take action. So the treaty and the Secretariat want to push for really ambitious action, but don't want to set these goals that are way out of reach. So they want things to be a little bit tangible. They also, like I mentioned, put the onus on developed countries. So while I would say in the past 5 to 10 years, we have recognized that all countries have a role to play in climate action, the treaty really focuses on making those developed countries who started the climate change problem and really driven it the past few decades, making them responsible for their actions and making sure that they're actually following through on the pledges that they make. An important part of that is directing funds to the most vulnerable. And this is another one of the objectives of the convention. And funding is important for both adapting to climate change and mitigating climate change. Countries, especially developing ones who maybe haven't contributed to climate change historically as much, they need the funding to implement technologies that help reduce their emissions as they develop and they become more industrialized, while they also need funding to create adaptive measures, recognizing that climate change is happening right now. It's going to continue happening for the years to come due to this lag effect of climate change. And so they need funding from those countries who are the most responsible so that they can protect their communities and their environment. It also seeks to keep tabs on progress towards climate action, and I'll talk a little bit about this more in a few slides because it's very relevant to the upcoming COP conference. And more recently, they've been trying to prioritize adaptation. In the past, especially, I would say up until the early 2000s, we really focused on mitigating emissions and going as deep as we can into emissions reductions. But now we're recognizing that climate change is here, it's happening now. And so while we're still focusing on mitigation, we need to be implementing some sort of adaptation measures at the same time to protect people today. And then don't worry about the overall structure of this diagram, but what I'm trying to show you here is the structure of the Framework Convention's Secretariat. So again, treaty and Secretariat are two separate things. The Secretariat is made up of 450 staff, as we discussed, and they're broken up into these separate little departments or divisions. They're all housed within that climate tower in Bonn that I was talking about. And you don't really get to see or hear from these individual departments that much, but I thought it would be cool to share with all of you what it actually looks like and show you how complex the organization actually is. So there's 4 main units, they're called. There's operations, programs, communications and engagement, and the intergovernmental support and collective progress. They all work together, but they have very different mandates and very different activities going on. And you can learn more about each of them individually by going onto the UNFCCC website. But it's very cool to see how different their mandates are and how they work together. And I put this little black star next to the communications and engagement one because that's the unit that I worked in. And I was specifically working within the Action for Climate Empowerment teams, which focus on mobilizing youth and equity deserving groups, and the gender team, so focusing mainly on empowering women to take climate action. So if you have any questions specifically about the work that was going on in that unit, you can definitely put those in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them as we move on. Now looking at what the UNFCCC has been able to accomplish to date, I would say a lot. Some people have different perspectives on how far an international treaty and secretariat can actually go to make change. but I think that it's a really important organization and initiative to have for coordinating global action because climate change is a global problem. Now, some of these on the screen might be familiar to you, they might be unfamiliar. And I should say that there were so many more treaties, work programs, and other initiatives that I could list on here, but I wanted to keep it brief and I wanted to keep it relatively high level. So one of the first ones that you all might be aware of is the Kyoto Protocol, which was established in 1997. And this was the first real binding treaty on emissions that these global countries signed on to. And binding means it's legally required for countries to meet the emission reduction goals that they set out to do. And this was specifically focused on developed countries. Kyoto didn't have that great of a history. Canada failed to meet its pledges and backed out a few years later. Most countries did not meet their pledges. So while it was a great idea and concept, and it was really cool that we were actually able to implement it, the actual outcomes, not as amazing, but it still showed that we could come together to commit to these emission reductions. Another big one was the Copenhagen $100 billion pledge. It's not a specific treaty, but in 2009 at COP15, developed countries came together and pledged that they would fund developing countries $100 billion a year in US dollars by 2020 to promote adaptation, mitigation, and other climate change action processes. That also didn't pan out. I can't remember what the specific number was, but it was very far away from this $100 billion pledge. But it was important for acknowledging that everybody needs to be playing a role in climate action, and some countries don't have the capacity due to historical injustices. And so we need to be supporting one another in this process. Probably the most notable one is the Paris Agreement that came out in 2015, and it really sets the course for our climate action agenda today because it's still going on, and it has a mandate from 2015 until 2030. The important thing to note about the Paris Agreement, there's actually two things. First, it's voluntary. So countries technically did bind onto this treaty, and treaties are supposed to be legally binding. But countries established their own emission reduction targets through the treaty, and it's voluntary for them to try and achieve it. So countries can say, these are our goals, and we'll try really hard to reach them, but there's no penalization if they do not reach those goals. And the second thing is that the Paris Agreement is for all countries. So all countries, not just developed ones, but developing as well, came into this agreement saying, okay, we all come from different places. We've all had different roles to play in climate change, but we're all going to contribute to the solutions in our own ways that work for us. And so I think that's a really unique thing about the Paris Agreement, that it's supporting this really diverse approach to a global problem. Another one that is probably lesser known is the Marrakesh Partnership, and this focused on advancing the role of non-state actors in climate action. And so as you become more familiar with the United Nations climate change, dialect, discourse, they tend to separate people or groups by being state actors or non-state actors. And in this case, we're talking about civil society organizations, nonprofits, indigenous organizations, industry, anybody who isn't considered a national government, basically. They all have roles to play in climate change and climate action, versus in the past, we really just focused on what countries and national leaders could do. But now we're recognizing that everybody, doesn't matter whether you work for the government or you're a community organization or you're an individual, everybody has a role to play, and we should recognize and value those roles, and that we should work together to solve this problem. Then we have the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage. This is really important for the following thing that came up, which is the Loss and Damage Fund that came out last year. The Warsaw Mechanism for loss and damage is recognizing the inequality for the least developed countries, and specifically the vulnerability they have to climate change. So for instance, small island developing states are very small countries. They're on an island, and for a lot of them, they might not exist by 2040, 2050, because they are being wiped out by sea level rise, and they don't have the resources to survive or even get their communities off those islands. And even doing that has significant implications for their culture and their communities. And so the Warsaw Mechanism is recognizing that not all countries have equal stakes in the climate action space, and it's not fair, and we need to be doing something about it. And so the Warsaw Mechanism, it didn't require countries to do much on addressing these inequities, but it did pave the way for the Loss and Damage Fund, which came out last year, like I said. And this was an actual pledge for developed countries to start funding developing countries, especially the least developed countries, to adapt their communities, to implement better mitigation strategies and things like that. The Loss and Damage Fund hasn't actually been operationalized yet. It hasn't been implemented because we're still working out the mechanics of it. And I'll talk about that again shortly. But it's something that's been in the works for about 30 years now. Especially the least developed countries have been advocating for some sort of loss and damage fund for that long. And so that moment last year really was monumental, because it was 30 years of struggle and effort and advocacy from these communities, and it was finally heard on the global stage. So like I said, there's so many more things that I could talk about, but these are just a few of the big ones where if someone asked you, what does the United Nations Framework Convention actually do? You could list off some of these, talk about them briefly, or if you take any sort of climate change course, it's really valuable to have a sense of what are some of the global treaties or initiatives guiding climate change action. These are a few of the key ones to know. Now we'll talk about the Conference of the Parties, and these are where these treaties and initiatives come from. They are considered the supreme decision-making body of the convention. So again, all these countries come together at these conferences to have these climate talks, to negotiate agreements, and to discuss the path forward. They've been happening since 1995, and they go on annually. The only year where one didn't happen was 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they rotate where they happen. The UN has 5 regions, and so that's what they consider there to be, and they rotate through each of those regions. It's usually where they have 2 conferences in one region, and then they'll move on to the next one. So this year and last year, the conferences take place in Africa, but then the years before that, they were taking place in Europe, and then they rotate like that. The presidency is the country that decides to host the conference for the year. So the president would be the one who is really the spokesperson for the conference, and then their country is considered the presidency or the host country. And to get that role, you would have to bid on the conference once you find out where it's happening. So let's say you find out, okay, the conference is going to happen in Africa this year. Countries can then start bidding and saying, we want to host this, here's why. And the United Nations makes a decision on that with its parties. And parties, I should say, are the countries who are bound to the treaty. And the outcomes of these conferences, after all the climate talks, are known as the negotiated text or the cover decision. So things like the Paris Agreement that I mentioned, the Marrakesh Partnership, all of those other treaties, they appear in the negotiated text that comes out at the end of the conference. A draft version is usually circulated about halfway through the conference, and there's a lot of revisions done. But at the end of the day, that is what the public, including us, see. That is what binds countries to take action in the year ahead. And that's usually what you end up seeing in the media. And it becomes very messy, and sometimes the conferences go on way longer than they were planning to go on. I think last year it ended 48 hours or 72 hours or something like that late, because the party delegates were going back and forth so much negotiating the text that they literally did not leave the room because they were arguing over it for so long. So it's cool to see what is included in the text each year. Usually it includes provisions around any existing treaties that the countries are required to be participating in. So there's always going to be things on the Paris Agreement, at least until 2030, and then we see what comes after that. But any new treaties or work programs or anything like that that are decided on at that conference will also be included in the text. And that text becomes available on the United Nations website. But again, it gets all over the news, so you'll probably see it somewhere else before you end up seeing it on the website. Now, as I mentioned, COP28 is happening this week. It starts, and COPs usually go for about 2 weeks. So this one is happening in the United Arab Emirates in Expo City, Dubai. And there's some really interesting discourse around the African COPs as they're happening. So last year it happened in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and then again this year is in the UAE. And this is really important because these are actually the very first COP conferences out of the COP history since the 90s that have taken place in Africa. And it's important for recognizing regional issues that haven't typically made the climate change agenda at the global scale in the past. I'll talk more about this later, but there are a lot of barriers to countries or to organizations in participating in the conferences. Funding, just accessibility, because they're all over the world, language barriers, so much. And so who is at the conference really influences the agenda. And so finally having conferences in African countries is really important for setting the stage for some of the greatest climate change inequities that happen to occur in these countries. And as I had said previously, the priorities established by the presidency are what set the tone and the pace for the conference. So the priorities that were set for the COP28 conference are pretty broad, but they weren't really a surprise, just given the climate change context from the years previous and what is known about this particular country and their priorities. But the four main ones that they've announced are around loss and damage, global stocktake, transforming Earth systems, so that includes things like the food and water systems and how they relate to climate change, and building climate resilience. I want to touch briefly on what a global stocktake is, because this is probably a new term for a lot of people, but it's something to take inventory of our climate action so far, mainly around what we've been doing with the Paris Agreement. Because as I mentioned, it started in 2015 and it goes until 2030. So we're at about the halfway mark of that treaty. And a lot has happened since we started 8 years ago. But we don't know exactly what it is yet that we have accomplished and how far we are from our goals and what is still needed. So a global stocktake, or the GST, is our way of understanding what's our current progress, where are we lacking, why are we lacking in that space, and what can we do about it? So the global stocktake is designed to happen it's a 2-year process, and it's supposed to happen every 5 years. So again, we're at this midway point to 2030. And so we've decided to take it now. I should also note that because of the pandemic, some of our climate action timelines got a little bit delayed. They got pushed back by a year. So the stocktake, I think, should have started a year earlier, but they started it at COP27 last year, and it's been going on since then. And now it's going to finally conclude at the upcoming conference. But aside from the importance that I mentioned for understanding our current context, it's really collecting this high quality data on our emission reduction goals and any other goals that were set out in the Paris Agreement. And some early data, this might not come as a surprise to any of you. This data shows that we're pretty far off from achieving our Paris Agreement goals, and I'll specify that it is to reduce our emissions 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. So that is the overarching goal of the Paris Agreement. And each country has established its own plan for achieving that goal. But our data so far shows that we're pretty far off from that. So the GST is designed to help us identify why are we so far off and what can we do about it. There's been 3 phases in this process so far. First was information collection and preparation. So this is something that the Secretariat has been taking the lead on. They've also been doing a technical assessment. So once they have all this information, understanding those gaps, identifying them, and then translating them into accessible, digestible information for their parties, for the general community, and then finally considering outputs. So now that we've done this stock take, what can we do about it? Why does it matter? And what kind of political action can we take? The stock take is also used 4 themes to guide its work so far. Those themes being adaptation and mitigation, and then 3 themes: means of implementation and support. And so they've been assessing progress along these 3 themes, and then the Secretariat will be putting out some recommendations for political action that will then feed into COP28. With that in mind, we talked about some of the overarching goals or areas that COP28 wanted to focus on, but the presidency has specifically put out these paradigm shifts that they want to help achieve at COP28. And a paradigm shift, if you're not familiar, is really like transforming the way that we do things from the root. It's not just about implementing small-scale solutions. It's really about what is the root of this problem and how can we change it? And so with a problem like climate change, it's not as simple as we'll just transition all of our diesel and gasoline cars to electric vehicles. That's an important part of the conversation, an important part of the solutions, but climate change is so much deeper than that. And so we need these paradigm shifts in how we think and how we act in society to actually achieve our climate action goals. And so the presidency has established 4 paradigm shifts that they hope to promote at the upcoming conference, and hopefully that will lead into decisions and agreements that come out of it. The first being fast-tracking the energy transition and slashing emissions before 2030. The second is transforming climate finance by delivering on old promises and setting the framework for a new deal on finance. So this goes back to that Copenhagen $100 billion pledge that I was talking about and how it hasn't been delivered on. And it's also talking about the loss and damage fund. The third paradigm shift is putting nature, people, lives, and livelihoods at the heart of climate action. So recognizing that it's not just about technology and technological solutions, it's about people and communities and their values and promoting climate action that works for people. And then lastly, and I want to dive into this one a little bit, they want to mobilize for the most inclusive COP ever. As I had said, COPs haven't always been very inclusive because there are so many barriers to entry for people, especially, for instance, in the Canadian delegation. It's been a big barrier for Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations to attend these conferences because they don't have the funding to send delegates across the world to attend them. The conferences are 2 weeks, all day, very intensive. And so if you only have 1 or 2 people going, they can't attend everything and they're going to be exhausted. So they might not have enough people to attend. The main languages that the UN uses at these conferences are English, French, and Spanish. But typically events only happen in English, and they might only be translated into French and Spanish for a few specific events. The big opening and closing might be translated into more languages, and a few other of the main events hosted by the presidency or the host country might be translated, but the side events that are run by governments, that are run by civil society organizations, they don't get privy to these translation services. So it might not be accessible to people. So COP28, their goal is to put inclusion and equity at the forefront, making it accessible to other communities, especially making it accessible to youth, which is cool. So they have their first, I think they're calling it the International Youth Delegation. So they're accepting a bunch of youth coming to the conference to share their perspectives in ways that youth didn't have the ability to do in the past. They're putting those African and regional climate change issues at the forefront. So for instance, COP27 last year, they really highlighted the role of the drought that was going on in the Horn of Africa and how that was related to climate change and how that was driving food insecurity. They put that at the forefront of conversations and really wanted the climate agreements to address those specific regional issues. And so COP28 also wants to take this regional inclusivity piece. But at the same time, it's interesting because, as I said, a lot of non-state actors can start attending COPs as well. And so you have been seeing industry coming. And more over the years, we've been seeing a lot of fossil fuel companies attending these conferences. At COP27, there were over 600 lobbyists for fossil fuel organizations, which is a 25% increase from COP26. And it's on one hand important to have these organizations there, especially in big oil countries like Egypt or the UAE. But there's concerns that having that many fossil fuel representatives there will start to skew the climate change actions and pledges that are taking place. And there was even some news that came out the other day. It was like some leaked agendas from the COP28 presidency about them having these behind the scenes, not negotiations, but conversations with fossil fuel companies. So the drama's already beginning around that. And I just wanted to highlight that to add a little bit of nuance to the conversation around inclusion. It's really important that we continue to put the spotlight on these countries, to follow up with their pledges, to be as transparent as possible when they're making climate action pledges, and for us as consumers to not just take things at surface level, but to do some deep dive research and understand what is the background of the country that is hosting this conference, what might their interests be, and how might that translate into the conversations that are had at COPs. So as you start to engage with COP28, if you do at all, I encourage you to start thinking about that, to follow the news, and just understand that I wish it was a world where we could just say, let's stop climate change, and everybody agrees and takes action, but it's a lot messier than that. Now for another little engagement activity, we're going to switch to a Jamboard. And so the Jamboard link should be posted in the chat momentarily. And I want us to have a quick conversation about the kind of issues that you as individuals want to see tackled at COP28. So I've talked about some of the key paradigm shifts that they hope to happen there and some of the themes that will be tackled at COP28. But now, what specific issues do you see that you want them to tackle? And you could make it very specific. You could say, I want a specific treaty or work program related to this issue, like water or food security or something like that. Or you can keep it general, but just share your thoughts. I'm also going to switch screens now to screen share the Jamboard so we can all see the answers as they start to come in. If you just give me one moment. Okay, so great. I can already see some comments coming in. If you're not familiar with Jamboard, you can see my cursor on the screen right now. You just navigate over to where this little sticky note button is, and you can click it, and then you'll have a sticky note appear. You can type whatever you want. And you can change the color, and then you can move it around the board. So we'll take a few minutes now, and we'll start populating this. And feel free to add more than one. Feel free to add only one. You can add a sticky note that pops off of somebody else's comment. So for instance, somebody wrote about circular economy. If you have any thoughts around circular economy, what that might look like, then you can add a comment onto that and put your sticky note closer to that one. I also see some comments around energy transitions and decarbonization, especially from richer countries. That really feeds into this fossil fuel piece that I was talking about and the regional economies. And I think that will be a really big issue covered at COP28 for that reason. I see one on the connection between resource extraction and genocide of Palestinians. I think that having that conversation will be really central to COP28 as well, because the broader geopolitical issues that are going on in the world tend to influence the climate change conferences. So last year, COP27, we were talking a lot about the war in the Ukraine and how food insecurity and other resource insecurity issues and climate change were a part of that discourse and what we could do about it. I see some on Canada and tar sands. The Canadian delegation will definitely be addressing its oil and fossil fuel industries there. Carbon capture strategies. I have a feeling, I'm not involved in the Canada delegation, but I have a feeling that they'll be talking about carbon capture strategies because the fall economic statement just came out in Canada, and there were some measures around carbon capture use and storage technology. So I wouldn't be surprised if Canada has some conversation on that. I see as well stronger language around fossil fuel phase out. So for anyone who's not familiar, I think it was COP26 in Glasgow in Scotland. There was the Glasgow Treaty was very specifically trying to address fossil fuels and included the words like fossil fuel phase out and fossil fuel phase down for the very first time. That was the first time in the Framework Convention's history where they actually explicitly said fossil fuels are driving climate change and we need to do something about them. The language has become a lot more lax since then, and there haven't actually been any tangible steps to strengthen those commitments. So I have a feeling there will also be some work around that. Great, we're seeing so many diverse sticky notes popping up. You can continue populating this if you want. We will navigate back to the slides just because I can see it's getting quite full now. And you'll have access to this later as well in case you wanted to refer back to the sticky notes that people were posting. Can we see the PowerPoint presentation again?
We can.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so again, thank you so much for your participation there on that Jamboard. Some great thoughts. Now, from the Jamboard, I had been talking a little bit about what I anticipate Canada might do, but let's actually talk about Canada's role in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and what we've done so far and where we still stand to take action. So under the treaty, as signatories to it, we have a few roles that we're required to do. One of them is creating a nationally determined contribution. So as I said, this is our climate action plan for achieving the Paris Agreement. We include a national greenhouse gas inventory. We report on it regularly, and we include communications on how is our government communicating to the public, what our commitments are, how are we communicating on our progress, and where do we stand to take more action. So these nationally determined contributions are updated every few years. We were just required to update one in 2022, I believe, or 2021 to 2023 is when countries started updating theirs. And that's from the previous one that they would have created at the beginning of the Paris Agreement. And that is what guides things like our net zero action plan that you see at the national scale, our adaptation plan, our climate finance delivery plan. All of these come back to our NDC. Then from a regulatory standpoint, as I mentioned just now, these different acts that we've implemented in Canada, they all tie back in to the NDC. And our ability to execute on these plans and then report on those are required under the Framework Convention, and that will contribute to the broader goals under the Paris Agreement. And then lastly, we're required to engage with the community, engage with the Secretariat, with other countries on our climate change goals. And so to do that, we have different mechanisms. We have our national focal points, which might be a new concept to most of you. These are delegates typically within the federal government that go to the climate conferences and attend meetings throughout the years as well on specific issues. So for instance, when I was working for the Action and Climate Empowerment team, Canada had a national focal point for action for climate empowerment. So his name was Patrick, and he's actually very young. He was a recent graduate, so it's cool if you're wondering, how can I fit into the climate action space? We have very young sustainability leaders who are leading the climate action plans and negotiations for Canada. So that's just a bit of inspiration for you. And so Patrick is responsible for any commitments or plans that Canada makes around youth inclusion. Then we also have the negotiations where, again, this is where our federal government come in. They have these conversations around climate action, our progress, and represent the Canadian perspective. And then that leads to any sort of treaties or outcomes at the conferences. And then Canada also hosts a pavilion, or basically an event booth at COP. And this is where we host events from the Canadian perspective. So my work, for instance, my company I work for now will be hosting an event around what is the role that the Canadian forest sector has in climate action, and how is that contributing to carbon offsets, the net zero progress, and things like that. And so we host a bunch of different events that representatives from all countries can attend. In terms of our actual progress, though, I thought this was important to flag, because we have these really great plans and initiatives in place, but overall, we've not been making much progress on them. But as you can see from the map in the top right corner, the countries who are covered in this tracker, which is called the Climate Action Tracker, nobody's doing great. But Canada in particular, the Climate Action Tracker would consider our progress as highly insufficient. And basically, if everybody in the world was to adopt our current approach and our current progress, our world would warm potentially 4 degrees warmer by 2100, compared to our goal of 2 degrees, so double that. Or ideally, we don't want warming to happen more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So overall, we're just not doing great. And there's a lot of different news you can read, a lot of different briefing notes, position papers from the government, and so many other resources to understand why this is happening. But it really goes to show that we have a lot of space to take further action. Now I want to move on to what you as individuals can do to make action, because we've talked about what COPs are, how they run, what's happening, the Canadian process. And so it might be hard to see where you as an individual fit into that. And honestly, you fit into the whole picture, and it might seem separated and far away at this point, but once I show you all these different opportunities to get involved, you can see where you can fit in, and you can use your own skills and strengths to contribute not just to Canada's climate action initiatives, but the global climate action initiatives. First would be Youngo, which is the youth constituency to the UNFCCC. This is a group of amazing, passionate young people from around the world. It's voluntary. They're very easy to find. You can just look up Youngo on Google, and they have different working groups for climate finance, water, food, buildings, anything you're passionate about that's related to climate change. You can get involved. You can do presentations for the Secretariat, for countries. They're just a great group. And they also have a newsletter and a mailing list that you can get involved in, or you can sign up for, and then you can stay in the know for global climate news from around the world. There's the Action for Climate Empowerment team within the UNFCCC. So like I said, they're the ones that coordinate youth empowerment and youth engagement in the space, and they're always hosting events and looking for ways to engage youth more. So if you're interested in learning how the Secretariat is integrating youth and what you can do there, you can look for this group. Again, a quick Google search is a great way to do that. If you have a co-op position, or you plan on working for the government at some point, you can also try and get in as a negotiator. Typically, these are more senior level positions, but when I was on my internship, I did meet a young negotiator on the Norway team. Her name was Emily, and she was fresh out of university, and she was on the lead negotiation team. So she was representing Norway in the country negotiations. So it is possible. That one can just be a little bit tougher, but if you plan on working in the government, this is a great way to get involved in the global climate discourse. You can do internships and fellowships. This is what I did. You just apply online. There's so many different internships going on at one time in all different units. And then the last one would be the youth stocktake. This is kind of related to Youngo. And this is an initiative that I think will be wrapping up at COP28. But similar to the global stocktake, youth were trying to understand what is our status on climate action, how are youth being involved, and how can we take it further? And so it will likely happen again in the future, but it's a great way to understand how are youth being involved right now and how can we progress this further? And by looking at the information coming out of this youth stocktake, you can use it to implement your own initiatives, potentially at the local level, in your school, things like that. Now, when it comes to engaging with COP28, there's a few different ways you can get involved. Probably one of the most practical ones as it starts this week is to watch it online. Maybe if you are involved in a club on campus, you can host a watch party as an event. So you can see specific events that are coming up. You can take notes on it. You can share it online. It's a little too late to do this now, but you can join the university delegation because each year the University of Waterloo sends a few students and staff to the delegation. I think I saw on the Zoom call that we have one of the students who are going to the COP28 delegation joining this call, so that's really cool. Like I said, you can join Youngo or you can sign up for their mailing list. You can attend the Conference of Youth, which is what COI stands for, or the local Conference of Youth. So this feeds into the Global Stocktake, and it's an annual conference for youth, hosted by youth each year to understand what are the gaps, what are youth doing, and it feeds into the COP conferences where youth then report on what they were hearing. So myself and a few other current U-Waterloo students presented at the Canadian Local Conference of Youth this past year, and so the information from that conference feeds into COP28. You can speak with the ACE National Focal Point if you want. I can provide his contact information. Again, he's a great person. I'm sure you'd be happy to connect with anybody if you're interested in learning what Canada is doing in climate action. And then you can apply for an internship or try to turn it into a co-op. I will preface and say that the internships through the UN are typically unpaid. So if you have the financial capacity to do that, you can usually do those internships remote as well. But that's a really great way to get this deeper understanding of the Secretariat and how it works. The last thing before I provide you some resources and we go into a Q&A, we're going to flip back to this Jamboard and I'll screen share the Jamboard again. Oh, let me, 1 second. Screen sharing can always be so difficult. So we'll go back to the Jamboard now. We're going to go to slide 2 on the Jamboard. Sorry, it's blocked for me. So at the top here, you'll see that we have 2 slides. So I want you all to click the right button and go to the second slide. And we're going to answer the prompt, what have you done to take climate action? So again, in the chat momentarily, you should be able to see the link for the Jamboard, or you can just go back to the link that we previously used. It's the same one, but you should be able to access the second slide where we'll start sharing what have you personally done to take climate action? And I think this is important for us to discuss because while I've talked about different ways that you can get involved in the UNFCCC space, how you can get involved with COP28, it's really important to appreciate the small individual actions that everybody is already taking. I would love it if you come away from this conversation today with some new inspiration for how to take action, for how to watch COP28, how to engage, how to just engage with the UNFCCC moving forward, but also to celebrate any sort of actions that you're taking so far in your life, because everything matters. Everybody has a role to play, and we should celebrate those small things. So I can already see that there's been a few inputs shared here. Commuting using active transportation, like the ION, that's an amazing, using active transportation or the ION, or public transportation, is a great way to reduce emissions. In the region of Waterloo, I know that transportation is the largest source of emissions in the community. So finding ways to reduce your personal emissions through how you get to school, how you get to work, your groceries, all those things, that's a great way to reduce your emissions. Some people have joined their school's climate justice ecosystem group, which is a great initiative. And if somebody's involved in that, in this call, it would be amazing if you could share some more information maybe in the chat. I personally follow the Instagram page. I'm friends with the organizers, so I would love to see some support for their group and the initiative that's going on there and how they're really trying to bring an intersectional lens to climate change action and really promote equity within the climate space. Going vegetarian, dumpster diving for veggies. Food is such a key way that we can take climate action because we all eat every day, multiple times a day, ideally. And so how you choose to eat and the types of food you eat have very different emission footprints, water footprints. And so if you're looking for an accessible way to take action immediately, looking at the foods you eat is one way to do that. And I'm seeing things like different events getting involved in community groups. Again, so many great ways to do action in manners that are digestible and accessible to you. And the goal of this exercise is to showcase to you all that climate action will look different for everybody. So what one person in your class or one of your friends might be doing might look different from your form of climate action. And I don't want you to compare and say one person is better than the other, or one person is doing more than the other, because we're all just trying to do our best. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. So after this, if you start to engage with the UNFCCC and you watch COP, you organize a community event, a campus event, amazing. If you decide to eat a different way or attend a community or campus event, whatever it is, it's amazing. And I want you to appreciate that and know that all those little actions help. So feel free to keep adding your notes. I'm going to switch back to the slides now just to share last few things before we wrap up and open it up for questions. In the follow-up to this call today, I want to share a few different resources with you, and I've listed them all on the slide here. There's all links, which will be much easier to distribute once this call is ended. But these are just some of the things that I think if you're interested in learning more about the climate action space, the global climate discourse related to the UNFCCC, these will be resources that will help you. So the COP28 virtual platform is where you can watch all of the COP events. You can just search it up online right now if you're interested in, or again, we'll share it before the conference starts so you can actually watch. Carbon Brief is this amazing platform that provides really in-depth analyses, policy briefs around climate change. They provide briefs before COP, during COP, and after COP about what's happening, and it's really digestible, and I love all of their resources. I also shared lower down in the list, they just released this this note about who wants what and basically what different countries are coming into COP28 hoping to achieve. And then there's so many other things on here. Again, the Youngo membership, ACE, the Action for Climate Empowerment group, have a newsletter website. You follow Clear the Air, which is my initiative. I haven't posted it on there much lately, but there's a lot of great resources for understanding the fundamentals of climate change and all other intersectional sustainability issues, and so much more. But all of this to say, there is so many resources out there for you to take action, and I encourage you to explore some now, explore some after this call, and just find ways that are meaningful to you to take climate action. That is all for the formal presentation part of this. I'll now open up the discussion to any questions or comments. I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see the chat, but feel free to start sharing any questions or comments, and we'll try to take a few questions at least before we wrap up. So someone has asked, what did you mainly do at your internship with the UNFCCC? Yeah, so like I said, was working in the communications and engagement division, and they're responsible for translating any of those really technical documents like treaties, work programs, anything that comes out of the conferences. They're responsible for translating it into content for the general public, and making them realize, okay, what are countries doing? How does this treaty apply to us? What can individuals do? It's really what I like to do as a climate communicator. So that's what I was doing there. I was writing blog posts, newsletters, resources for the general public, as well as our different countries' constituencies. We were hosting events. And because I was working in the youth and the gender teams, my content was mainly focused on what's going on for gender equality and youth empowerment in the climate change space. And as Michelle said, if you have a question, you can feel free to put your video back on as well if you want, so we can have this more like a discussion. And if there's any other questions, again, feel free to put them into the chat. In terms of my internship as well, and I can add this to the resource list that gets sent out to you after, through my internship with the university, I wrote some blog posts that dove into the specifics of my internship and what I did during them. So there was 3 blog posts. So we can share those afterwards in case you're interested. So you can understand, what does the structure of an internship with the UN look like? What might you be doing? How long is it? That type of stuff. My internship was around 6 months, I think, or 5 or so months. But you can do them for as little as 3 months or as long as, I think, 8 to 10 months.
I think I've got a question from Madeline. She's
Yes.
got her hand up.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see the hand. Yes, go for it.
Hi, sorry. Hi, Jenna. I just want to say I'm in the MAG program as well, loving it so far, and been following you on LinkedIn for like forever. So I love the stuff that you put out, and it's awesome. My question is kind of about your personal thoughts on what I feel like is increasing like fossil fuel solutionism at COP conferences, and obviously like increasing corporate presence, like you mentioned. Do you think that there's still like meaningful places to kind of like generate climate action among people, or do you think it's kind of just a conference for the sake of a conference that like people can go to and talk about that generates like a lot of emissions but doesn't result in a lot of like meaningful progress, especially when I feel like a lot more of the agenda items or the ones being pushed by certain actors have to do with like technologies that just aren't what people say they are, like carbon capture or like hydrogen energy and some of these techno-scientific solutions. So do you think we're kind of moving toward a space where COP conferences are still meaningful and propelling action, or do you think that they are kind of just more increasingly a space for corporate actors to push their agenda?
Yeah, that's a great question, Madeline. I think it's tricky because on one hand, we do need those technological solutions, especially when it comes to mitigating climate change. But I would agree that I think our conversations are gearing more and more towards, we can solve this through technology. And while we have things like the Loss and Damage Fund coming out, and stronger pushes and stronger presence of these equity deserving groups at the COP conferences who are trying to push for more community and socially oriented solutions, I don't think it's actually translating into action yet. And in terms of whether these conferences should actually continue to take place, I think that there is an important space for them. One, because it brings climate change center stage for people around the world. I don't think that people on their, well, less so in the past year or two, I feel like climate change has really taken the main stage for media because of all the disasters that have been going on. But I think aside from that, it's really one of the only opportunities we have to understand what our countries are doing, what our national leaders are doing on climate change and what we can do. But I think that there needs to be a lot more transparency and a lot more accountability to be taking action, to not just be saying we're going to do something and then next year saying we're going to do it again and then doing it again. So if there is some sort of stronger accountability mechanism there, it's super messy because it's a global thing and like there's no international body that like governs. Messy. But yes, I think that there is a purpose for these conferences. I just think that we need to recenter ourselves and recognize that especially the conversation around just transitions needs to be center stage, and that we need to be talking about equity when we're talking about climate solutions, and that technology are not always going to be the solutions that are equitable. And so what are the solutions that these equity deserving groups need, and how can we support them? Great question, though. I love that one. I see from Emilio, what do you feel is Canada's biggest struggle against reaching its 2030 climate goals? It's tough because we, on one hand, we have this progress, we have the National Adaptation Strategy, we have our net zero plan, but we haven't seen those things translate into action. Part of it comes from our federal government system where provinces have the power to implement their own solutions, I think. And so it's important from an agency standpoint and empowering communities and provinces to implement relevant climate change solutions for them. But it also can prevent the sort of top-down solution-making process that the federal government tries to use. And with a country as large as Canada, because we have one of the largest land masses and we have such different climates and ecosystems across the country, no one climate solution is going to work for everybody in our country. So I think that's one of the challenges we face. Another is that our fossil fuel industry is so central to our economy. And we recognize that the fossil fuel industry employs so many people in our country. It's essential to our economy, but we're struggling to understand how can we transition away from those? How can we build a resilient economy that's not reliant on fossil fuels while still protecting people and the planet? And we're just not taking the steps that we probably need to be taking in order to implement solutions and actually meet our goals. So I think it's a mixture of, we have the ambition, but we haven't figured out how to turn that into action, and we're not taking that dive to actually implement those changes yet. And I think there's one more question, so I'll probably take that as the last one anyways, just because we have about 3 minutes left. What do you do in your current role, and did the UN internship help bring you to where you are today? I definitely think that the internship brought me to where I am. I'm working, and not to say that I ever imagined working in forestry, but I'm currently working in sustainable forestry management and understanding what is our sector doing to promote climate change resilience. I specifically work a lot on equity within the forestry sector and how are we promoting youth empowerment, gender equality, the inclusion of just diverse peoples in the sector and what that looks like. Also, how does the sector play into affordable housing and other things like that? So while not directly linked to what I did at the internship, the skills I was learning from global climate change agreements, understanding what Canada's role is, what Canada's economy is like, all of these things really did help me in the skills that I learned during it. And I think that really goes to show that you might have co-ops, you might have experiences with clubs and initiatives in university that might not seem entirely relevant to the jobs you end up getting, but a lot of them have really transferable skills that you can apply and use to your strengths in your resumes and your interviews and things like that. And it might land you in a position where you might not have expected it, but you're actually taking action in ways that are incredibly meaningful and maybe just something you didn't consider when you first started. And if anybody has additional questions about what I do now and how I got there, happy to have a follow-up conversation. I can put my email in the chat. It was on that slide, but I'm always happy to answer any questions or comments, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. But I think I'll leave it there and I'll pass it over to Michelle to close. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Jenna. A big round of applause for her. It was so great to hear also from a young person about all your insights with the UN from your own experience. And yeah, really great to have you as part of our Climate Leaders program, Jenna. Thank you so much for doing this workshop today. And thanks everybody for attending as well. And we'd encourage you to come out to our next event as part of the Climate Leaders series, which is Climate Drinks at the Grad Lounge this Friday. So I'll just put a link in the chat to register for that event if you're interested. So come out, keep joining us, and Jenna, keep doing your good work. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.